the Daily Objective, the last one before the Daily Objective becomes a live thing in London. So today, Friday, with me, Dr. Jason Rheins. Hi, Jason.
Hi.
Jason is a research fellow in Montessorium, someone who has written and thinks from an objectivist point of view. And today we're discussing a topic which is a big interest of mine, which is Marxism. And most importantly, do what most people today consider the left. Is this Marxism? Is this even Neo-Marxism, which is a term we hear very often? We hear people like Jordan Peterson talk about, for example, postmodernist Neo-Marxism. So the question we're going to ask is the new left, and by the new left, I don't only mean the movement that called itself New Left in the 60s, for example, the Union for a Democratic Society. I mean, most of the expressions of the left in the last decades, which are not part of the, let's say, the communist parties, which would consider the old left. So is the new left a continuation of Marxism with other means, or is the end and the death of Marxism? So, Jason, what are your starting thoughts, and what do you think we should discuss first?
Great. So, I mean, I think the best thing to do is to define our terms and then take a little bit of a historical survey. And the first thing to do is to start with Marxism itself. So Marxism is, right, the product of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. It was one of a number of different 19th century socialistic philosophies with its own distinctive traits. And I think the first thing to talk about is what's distinctive about it. And you're, as a former Marxist, I'm sure can list off. I'll start with one. It was formulated by Marx as a kind of inversion of Hegelian dialectic. So in Hegel's thought, right, history is a sort of set process by which the world spirit comes to know itself through human activities and the clash of ideas. Marx thinks, well, forget the world spirit thing, but history is a series of sort of clashes of different classes who are situated where they are in history and set up to do what they will for certainty do based on material conditions. So it's materialist rather than idealist, and the relative things are the means of material production. So figuring out who controls how you make stuff and what kind of stuff you can make, and then how people are situated with respect to these material goods and material circumstances. If you have enough of that information, it will guarantee what will happen next in history. Exactly. I think that's the first pillar of Marxism. Would you agree to that characterization of it? Both how I've described dialectical materialism, a class of history is driven by the class of economic classes, class warfare, which is determined by their material circumstances and how they stand with respect to the means of production.
Exactly. Put in other words, if it hasn't got a theory of history, it's not Marxism. And if it hasn't got that theory of history that you explained. Let me put another thing on the table. Political systems developing progression in a dialectical way, which means the contradiction of one system gives rise to different system. Primitive communism, slavery, feudalism, capitalism, which will give rise to something else. So if the theorists you have in mind don't have such a view of history and don't see that after capitalism there's going to be a completely different system, and they're talking about progressive taxation or whatever, it's not Marxism. It might be something else, it might be something bad, but it's not Marxism. There is no Marxism without, as you said, the theory of history, but also a theory of history in stages. And how do we reach these stages? Through the way that you described.
Now, at various times, Marxists sort of took aim at one another with respect to how flexible you could be about the specific historical progression. because Marx and Engels had made certain predictions about how this must go. So for example, if you look at the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels survey a number of earlier socialist philosophies, and they say none of these caught on. None of these have overtaken Europe. Why? Not because they're wrong, but because the conditions were not right economically at the time for it to arise. They say what has to happen is you need a highly industrialized capitalist system where there is an urban industrial labor force, the proletariat, who, if they revolutionize and seize control of the means of means of production, they will be able to create a communist society. But they say, like, but for example, classical Marxism is not about agrarian communism. It's not about the peasants rising up against aristocrats or anything like that. So when pre-industrial countries like Russia, like China, had communist revolutions, people like Lenin, people like Mao, had to account for how it would be possible for their countries to achieve a successful communist revolution, despite the fact that they didn't look like late 19th century industrial Germany or England, which is what Marx and Engels thought you needed. And so you got, you got Marxist Leninism, or you got revisionism. And to some classical Marxists or Marxians, this was heretical. But I think it's fair to say that all of these were very much in the spirit of Marxism. It's just they had to keep fudging it on their historical predictions. Their philosophy says you can predict history. All their predictions were wrong. They would go back and change their predictions after the fact to make it sound like it would work. But I still think that was the same thing. But I think if it's not, I don't think it's Marxist, even in this broad sense of a family of Marxisms, if it doesn't have this historical determinism, if it talks about things. And I should say, one thing that's really important about Marxism, maybe a second kind of thing, is, and here I think we will see a similarity, at least with the New Left, is that ideology is superstructure. That is to say that people's beliefs, the stated ideals of a nation or its intellectuals, really arise out of the class interests of these people and their class at a given time. So there's something sort of insincere or just not the real action. So in Hegel, the ideas of the world spirit literally are history and move history. In Marx, ideas don't move history. Economics and revolutions move history. Ideas serve as their mouthpieces, sort of after the fact. Now, that said, communist regimes invested enormous resources into thought control and propaganda. But, well, among other things, they were wrong. But I think that's a second thing, is that ideology is superstructural, epiphenomenal, if you will, is a key materialist kind of premise for true Marxism.
I think you mentioned something important there, which is we might find epistemological similarities between Marxism and what we'd consider parts of the New Left. But again, Marxism is a thing. It's like saying, oh, yeah, I agree with objectivism that A is A, but I disagree with everything else, but I'm still an objectivist. No, yeah. In that case, you're not. Yeah. Let me add another thing in the discussion. The role of the revolutionary class.
Yes.
And it's very important that it's a class which is, as Marx would say, universal class. What does this mean? It means that through its position in the class struggle, through its relationship to the means of production, it's a class that can materialize, that can express the interest almost of every human being. And this class for Marx is the working class. Yeah. So without a universal class, there is no Marxism. Now, you could say this class can form alliances. So as you mentioned, the peasants. So for example, it can be, or a popular front, as the Stalinists would put it in the 30s. So class, the working class coming into alliance with, let's say, the petit bourgeoisie. But there is one class that has the leading role, even if it's in alliance with other classes.
Yeah.
If this is missing, it's not Marxism. Without a universal revolutionary class, there is no Marxism, and the universal revolutionary class is not there in the vast majority of the New Left.
Yeah, I think it's one way to put it is that for any given revolution, for any given key moment in the material dialectic, one class is positioned in an essential way to transform things, and it is the indispensable class, and the way it will deal with the means of production will kind of set the agenda for everything else. Other classes may become involved just in the warfare in the streets or whatever. So there may be petite bourgeoisie, there may be some intellectuals who are the sons of bourgeois who play a role in the coming of it, but they're irrelevant unless factory workers take over. And they may have some allies among the farmers, but they're not essential either. So just like say in Plato's analysis of different states, there are different classes in these, but one has the kind of ruling interest, and the entire shape of the state and the aims of the state is really determined by the aims of its ruling class. So the revolutionary class is that class whose situation and aims brings about this new dialectical moment.
So instead of this, what has the New Left mostly given us? It has given us new social movements and identity politics, which I would say both of them deny these central universal parts of the class.
I want to add, before we go to all the New Left thing, I think there are one or two other things we should.
Yeah, let's finish. You're right. Let's finish Marx. Let's finish Marx.
At least, I'm not sure how much this is in Marx. I haven't read all of Marx's works, but it's certainly a major part of Marxist-Leninism is the critique of imperialism. So there is a specific critique that the way capitalism, the way late stage capitalism works, or at least 19th century and then early 20th century capitalism works, is you create overabundance of goods that sort of nobody needs. And in order to make money off it, you need to create new markets. And the way that you do this is you go out and you conquer people and you force them to sort of buy your products. And this further impoverishes them and kind of puts them in a position of subjugation, which makes them potential allies for a communist revolutionary vanguard who want to overthrow the capitalist class. They are not the revolutionary class, but they are potential allies. Now, I think there's nothing about this story makes any sense. Like, first of all, why are you producing so much more than you can sell in the first place? Like, aren't producers smart enough to know what kind of market they can sustain? Couldn't they think of something like, I don't know, advertisement? Also, why are they trying to build markets for these goods in places that don't have the infrastructure or the wealth to sort of buy them? And then how did this impoverish them if they got all of these excess cheap goods? And did they just? I mean, none of it makes any sense. But the idea that all the evils of imperialism, colonialism, stem from the needs and dynamics of capitalism is, I think, a Marxist-Leninist kind of sticking point, becomes a major part of how Russia, talks about the US and other places in the UN and things like that. And I do think this is a place that the New Left has absolutely inherited the old Marxist story, that capitalism is responsible for the evils of colonialism. I think with just slight tweaks, they now say capitalism is responsible for the evils of racism, which I don't think makes any more sense than the colonialism bit. But I do think this is one thing that comes, I don't think it's the essence of Marxism, but it was a major kind of Marxist talking point, especially Marxist-Leninist one. And I do think it's one where you do see continuity into the New Left. Yeah, go ahead.
Finish with these points, and then we'll go to one more point of Marx.
Oh, go ahead.
So the final point I would add is a theory of a revolution. And the theory of revolution says that this class, this universal class, the proletariat, guided by a revolutionary party, and this is very, very important. There's no haphazard spontaneity, guided by a party, brings a violent revolution which brings down the system and brings a different economic system. It doesn't bring reforms, it doesn't bring more progressive taxation, it brings a different complete system, which has a name, the dictatorship of the proletariat. So there's no Marxism without working class revolution, guided by its party and followed by the dictatorship of the proletariat.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. That's a key component. The dictatorship of the proletariat as the economic system, which is its outcome. Obviously, like Marx and Engels at various points have like utopian kinds of statements. They say, we can't tell you what it will be like. This is important because, again, they are dialectical philosophers in the sense that we belong to this standpoint, this class, this time period. We don't know what it will look like. We can't think about what it'll look like. We can't reason with those who will come later, but we can think it will unlock all this human potential in some magical way, and you'll be growing pineapples in Siberia and so on. And then I was going to say that I was going to add that I don't know how important this will be to our analysis, but a key component of Marxism is Marx's labor theory of value and economic exploitation. So his economic exploitation sort of falls out of a labor theory of value. So the labor theory of value is the idea that something is worth how much work went into it, and not what an agreement between a mutually beneficial or potentially mutually beneficial agreement between seller and buyer at the highest price the seller can get and the lowest price the buyer can get, or anything like that. It is somehow this intrinsic thing based on the labor that went into it. And since you're not getting sort of paid on the basis of that, workers are exploited. I mean, in general, if you don't own the means of production, if you and your fellow factory workers don't own the factory, then you show up, you get a wage, you produce this stuff, you have no stake in that stuff. It doesn't belong to you. Even though you put in all of the work, even though it's the product of your hands, you don't get it. This leads to alienation, the feeling that you have been disassociated from what you have produced and what you have done. So I guess these are two separate things: the theory of sort of alienation, the theory of / exploitation of workers versus the labor theory of value. I think the labor theory of value leads into that because it's what leads you to think like, obviously this is not fair because what you produce is not worth, the wage, it's worth some intrinsic thing. So I think that some of these things and not others show up in some New Left and not others. That is to say, I think the exploitation bit is there all the time, that the poor are exploited, that they aren't treated like stakeholders, that markets are inherently unfair, but the fundamental mechanism of prices in the market is not a moral mechanism, and that it tends to be an exploitative mechanism. I think that whole vibe of Marxism has passed on into the left, or at least the far parts of the left. I do think, and maybe perhaps you'll agree with me, that the center left has gotten sort of more center on this in the last 40 years, or more neoliberal and so on. May I add one last thing about Marxism?
Can I comment something on the previous point?
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Before we leave this point,
Yeah.
I have a slightly different take from you. I agree with how you described as Marxism, but I think that the focus of today's left on things such as income inequality would be alien to Marxism. So quite often I would say my students in my Marxist class, put a Word document, everything that Marx has written, and do Control F for income or inequality. It's almost not there. Why? Because as you said, it doesn't matter if the worker gets a higher wage or a lower wage, whatever. I mean, yeah, it's better if you get a higher wage, but this does nothing to the essence of his relationship with the capitalist, would say Marx, which is always a relationship of exploitation. So Marxism doesn't believe in Keynesian stimulus, in progressive taxation, blah, 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 blah. Whatever your wage is, no matter how good and kind and woke your boss is, you still are part of this exploitation. So yes, this exploitation theory is still in the left, but in a way that Marx wouldn't recognize as his.
I think that's a very fair point. It's not about, right, for Marx, it's not about income inequality. It's not about a living wage. It's not about access to healthcare as a right, or to the special services of a welfare state. It is about the state ownership of the means of production. It is about, so it is full-on hard socialist. Now Marx wants collectivization of private property, but sometimes people misunderstand this. Not personal property. And the distinction is, you can have your own like stuffed animal, you can have your own like, notebook at home, and nobody can take that. It's any kind of agricultural, industrial capital, right? Capital in any big way, not your small personal possessions, but any big way, which is private property, that he thinks has to belong to the state. And I think that doesn't strike me as the driving point of contention for the new left, in part because state-run economies have been largely discredited. I think they want to just sort of push to the left side of mixed markets and just kind of push for a bigger welfare state with more aid to the poor. But it is not, right? The state has to own all private property, which is to say all the means of production. And like that doesn't seem to be, maybe they want the government to break up this tech firm. They don't want the government to run it.
Yeah,
like, they're not saying that. So I think that's an important difference.
So I remember when I started hanging out in Austrian and libertarian circles during my transition from Marxism, there was this meme that had either Rothbard or Mises or Friedman who say there was one good thing about Marx. He was not a Keynesian. And that's true. So quite often today, when we talk about progressive politics, they're under the economic theory, so to speak, of Keynesianism, rather than of ideas that Marx himself would say. But you said you had one more point about Marx. What would that be?
Yeah. So it was, now I'm having trouble remembering. Maybe it'll come back to me. Maybe we should start talking about the new left.
Okay, it was after we were discussing revolution. So was it something relevant to that?
It wasn't a bit about revolution. Was it class? Was it ideology? Was it exploitation?
Future system?
No, it wasn't the future system bit. We'll see. We'll see where it goes. One thing is Marxism is avowedly atheist, and I don't think the new left, at least in the United States, the new left don't really care too much about that issue. I mean, the left as a whole, the new left does not own this, has a problem, rightly has a problem with the Christian radical right in this country wanting to legislate all kinds of issues out of their prehistoric philosophy, but not prehistoric, I guess it's biblical historic. But I don't think they're particularly pushing godlessness or anything like that. The opium of the masses kind of bit, that doesn't seem to be a big talking point I don't think, for the new.
That was mostly a thing in Europe because you had particular historical context. For example, in Spain, in the Spanish Revolution and the Spanish Civil War, it was part that the church had a very clear position with the other side, with the Francoist side. Italy, the same. The Catholic Church, the opponent of the Communist Party, literally was called Christian Democratic Party. So it was more like a local context. Okay, and since we're running out of time and we haven't even started with a new left, what's your quick take on where does the new left stand towards all these things? We've hinted on it, but what's your evaluation?
I mean, by new left, right, as you mentioned, there are two things we can mean. We can mean a kind of movement that starts in the 60s and 70s, where it would, the old left was Marxism and lesser and less radical forms of socialism. And the new left was something new. Many of the key thinkers of the new left had philosophies that were not Marxist per se, but were deeply influenced by Marx. So if you look at the Frankfurt School, or if you look at you look at Adorno, you look at Horkheimer, you look at Marcuse, you look at a bunch of French theorists in the 70s, they're very, very influenced by Marxism. They probably in their youth were Marxist of a kind. Maybe they got alienated during the Stalinist years, maybe not. But their analysis is not limited to the material dialectic of class. Like, they are now expanding to think about culture. They're expanding to think about sexuality. They're expanding to think about hegemonies over conceptual space. They are more explicitly, you might think, constructivist, subjectivist. So even though Marx is dialectical, so within a given standpoint, a given class, you can only understand that and not something else. At the same time, Marxism presents itself as scientific socialism. They think we have the truth. This is a science, like we can prove our claims about the future. They at least want to, it was bullshit, but they at least wanted to pretend that. And the new left certainly moves in a much more radically skeptical / relativist or constructivist sort of direction. But they do still think of themselves as the left. They do still think of themselves as anti-capitalist. They're explicitly anti-capitalist. They see capitalism as the problem. They see socialism as the progressive move. They see capitalism as the cause of imperialism and racism and all these other bad things. But they become interested in all these new categories of understanding, often categories of understanding oppression and dimensions of oppression. I think when you get to today, those categories and those kinds of notions of identity, of race, gender, or gender identity, sexual orientation, those being probably the three biggest ones, have completely swamped any notion of economic identity. We are the working class or something like that. Like Marxism, they kind of think your identity is set by this kind of group designation, but it's not your class, it's your race or your sex, gender identity, or your sexual orientation, something like that. And I don't think the mechanisms they think of change are the same. I don't think the historical materialism stuff is the same at all. I think thinking capitalism, most of them, maybe not all, think capitalism is somehow tied into racism. I don't think they all think capitalism causes racism. I think some think that capitalism profited off of, or the capitalist countries profited off of racism through the slave trade and things like that. Or others think that it's just been complicit in it, but others might, I don't think like if you were all about race and gender and so on and wanted to change that and you were like, yeah, but like, I don't think markets are what caused this or something. I don't think they'd take away your card. You probably raise some eyebrows at parties and you looked askance if you were like, I'm not in favor of a living wage minimum thing. Like, you'd probably be out of the party. It's still the left. But like you said, there's nothing about living wage and there's nothing about, progressive income tax brackets in Marx. It borrows much more from European models of socialism, slightly to the right of Marx.
And they might bring up the points that Marx had towards the end of the Communist Manifesto, but this was more like a political transitional program. But what you said reminded me one point that I also wanted to add, which I think is a major difference and why the New Left would be non-recognizable from old Marxists. And it is Marxism, belief and faith, and putting it in not in a negative way, in economic progress.
Yeah,
so
that's right.
You have people like the Marxist historian Erich Hobsbawm saying that the one major benefit of socialism for the developing world was that it would industrialize the developing world. You have the 5-year plans in the Soviet Union. You have Marx talking about capitalism having created these miracles, like that put the pyramids to shame. And this is missing completely today. So for me, the one thing that completely kills any quote revolutionary potential from the left is its wedding with environmentalism. So the two main things is no theory of revolution, but also its take on economic progress.
Yeah, for all of its profound problems and its kind of Hegelian genesis and everything else, Marxism still was a Victorian era philosophy, one that promised a road of progress for mankind through science and technology and industrialization. And that benefit was for mankind, or at least the working class. And but it would continue and it would be good. And you should try to industrialize and so on. Clearly, the ecological or environmentalist movement, or at least its radical parts, are sort of incompatible with that. At least anything that sort of says that industrialization as a whole is a bad thing. Now, I think there are plenty of now this gets complicated because of climate change in a scientific question, a real scientific, not philosophical, scientific question of how much is human pollution, carbon byproducts actually endangering our survival or radical transformations that'll be really hard to deal with. And I think the scientific consensus is a lot, and it requires a lot of action. Now, what kind of action and so on? Ideally, the action that is most compatible with continuing industrial civilization, because our lives depend on it so much. But I think that it's easy, I think, to elide on the one hand people saying climate is it is a tremendous problem, it is urgent, we need to take it really seriously. We're not taking it seriously. Maybe we're not taking it seriously because of certain corporate and government interests, which, it has the feeling of an old kind of Marxist or leftist kind of trope, but maybe that's true. I mean, like, big companies have big lobbies. Like, I don't know, China certainly doesn't care, and they're pumping out tons of pollution, right? So you can distinguish that on the one hand from kinds of views that that industrialization was just bad per se, or kind of animal rights sorts of things that don't want us to favor human well-being, that posit some other thing to care about. I think that and the problem is that with the climate crisis, you can equally have kind of people being brought to the table or being drawn into this issue for malicious and reasonable reasons. I think, and I think that's why it's important to kind of distinguish these two things. Now, I think that 20 years ago, when the evidence was not so overwhelming that significant climate change was there was evidence that there was warming of global surfaces in the average over time, but that things would really shoot up, the evidence was more spotty. Serious scientists were still offering non-anthropogenic explanations, right? It turned out those didn't work, but it's not like they were ideologically driven. They were scientific hypotheses. They got tested, it didn't work. And 20 years ago, at least, like when I was in college, the track record for the doomsayers was bad. Like, people like Paul Ehrlich had been saying stuff like this since the 50s, and it had been wrong and wrong and wrong and wrong and wrong. And I think it was reasonable back then to be more skeptical. I think the science has just come so much further in 20 years, as has some of the outward effects of these changes. So I don't think the way that the ideologies relate to the political problem or the culture's sense of the problem is the same anymore. If I think that, but in general, to the extent that the left kind of favors deindustrialization, or where it's not just sustainable industrialization until a time where we can do more of it without endangering ourselves, or something like that, that's not a Marxist, that's not an old left view. And especially to the extent that they prioritize non-human interests over human interests. I remember the thing I was going to say about an element of Marxism.
Yeah.
Marxism was explicitly an internationalist philosophy. Even though Marxist parties would rise to the fore in certain countries, and then some of those countries would invade their neighbors and carry it on. Russia, I'm looking at you. It was thought of as an international movement. You know, their theme song was the Internationale. I think when you look at the New Left, I mean, they're certainly talking about global inequality and things like that. It's not a nationalist perspective. But on the other hand, in their hostility to free trade, and in a number of other things, I don't think they seem so internationalist. And I think, you know, I think it's just hard to kind of, it doesn't seem to be their beat, you know.
And to remind people, Marx, the political agitator, was for the repeal of the Corn Laws, which would impose some type of tariffs to corn. So you could say that Marx was more pro-free trade than the current left. Let me go to the super chat because we're running out of time. So thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you very much, Kmetia. So Caleb says, it seems like Marxism turns into anarchism. I would disagree with that because I see it turning more towards statism. And you could say, what do you mean more towards statism? There's nothing more statist than, let's say, I don't know, the Soviet Union. I mean, having more faith in the quote bourgeois state to take action supposedly in favor of the workers. This was not the case in traditional Marxism. Now, when it comes to the relations between Marxism and anarchism, we could have a whole episode, but I would say there are particular streams of Marxism and of anarchism that are closer to each other. Anarcho-syndicalism is one of the two. But overall, I would disagree that historically Marxism and anarchism are coming closer. Maybe they did in the 60s, but not today.
I think that's right.
That's another question which is difficult, so I'll have to think about it. Is there a concept, thank you, Eric, for your question. Is there a concept, term, or description that encapsulates the essentials of the ideas of the new left? So, Henrik, my quick answer would be no, because the new left is so wide. So you have, for example, from the anti-globalization movement to the environmental movement to feminism. I would overall say a disdain towards the free market, championing the overcoming of inequalities, but inequalities in terms of outcome, not in terms of rights. These are two things that come to mind. But from the top of my head, I cannot see how you could, with a concept or a term or a description, put the new left and encapsulate. I mean, you can't even do it with Marx. We spent like half an hour with Jason trying to figure out what are the core elements of Marx. But with the new left, it's even more difficult because it's even more of a diverse and dispersed phenomenon. Any thoughts on that, Jason?
Yeah, I tend to agree. I mean, I suppose maybe you could say something like identitarian anti-individualism or something, but that doesn't strike me as a very good fit. I do think one absolute fundamental is that at least at the philosophical roots of many parts of the new left lies the same kind of notion of a certain type of relativism of basically you are epistemically sort of set into a certain box that is your salient identity or identities, and that to some extent limits your ability to kind of talk to one another. So if you can, maybe we can link to it. Nikos and I had an earlier conversation about a month or so ago about lived experience and the way that this kind of is appealed to, and the idea that there's a certain incommunicability between two people from two different races or two different backgrounds or two different identities. So in general, I think that there tends to be a kind of anti-objectivity just in our ability to intercommunicate and have a shared access to a common reality. Some parts of the New Left, this is more more highlighted or featured than others. Maybe there are even some places where it's not really the issue that's driving them. Again, it's a wide panoply of positions. But I do think that in many of the different places, you're doing this. And I should say that another is just that I think in general, there is a notion, so in Marxism, like the means of production, who controls the means of production, sort of sets everything else in a given age. There are various kinds of New Left philosophies. You can think of like the work of Foucault here, or like that kind of think of power relations as doing this, but on a much deeper level, so that all kinds of our discourse and concepts and conversations are structured and built up in a way to preserve the power of certain elites at the advantage of others, and that kind of conceptual disintegration can be a form of resistance or something like that, or breaking down binaries is a way of getting out from this control. Now, when society is sort of telling you like there are only two ways to be, and it turns out you don't fit that, then not fitting that is an individualistic action and is objective. It's a reasonable thing to do. If they say either you're a girl who likes a boy or a boy who likes a girl, and that's not you, it makes sense to say that's not me. But to think that everything is sort of like that, and all of it is a kind of power move, all of it is control. I think that's just that kills the idea of the objectivity of concepts, or why we have concepts in the first place. It makes mistakes, how people can make mistakes, and makes everything malevolent rather than just ignorant or erroneous, even profoundly erroneous. So I think that's something you find in a lot of New Left discourse if you go deep enough. It's not always on the surface.
Makes sense, yeah. But again, it's a big umbrella term, and it's very difficult to pinpoint. But hopefully,
let me just say one thing. Like,
yeah.
There are weird things here in the New Left. So, for example, I've been discussing with some students of mine the fact that on the one hand, when at least in the United States, when it comes to identity of race, this thing race, which has almost no biological reality, right? So people that Americans would put in the same race have less in common genetically than people that Americans would put in two different races, right? Like there isn't a biological thing here, but they treat it as this essence, right? Like you're black. Nobody who was born white could ever become black. You can't say I grew up in a black neighborhood. I was raised by black parents. I was adopted, right? Like, and I'm black. Like you can't say that. No. On the other hand, something like gender identity, even, where again, gender or gender identity is not the same as biological sex, but something like but at least biological sex is a thing that's pretty much there in nature. There are some intersex people, but pretty much, we can look at your chromosomes, we can look at your anatomy, we can look at your hormone levels. There, it's radically subjective, and you say, well, I feel like I'm a woman, right? And then you can, and these are my pronouns, right? Again, I'm not saying you shouldn't honor someone's pronouns or something. I'm just saying it's interesting to see how one thing that seems like there's no intrinsic biological stuff is treated as very intrinsic, and another where there's some very strong like biological stuff, even though it's not the same as your gender identity, that's treated as radically sort of subjective. And so if you try to make one simple story and you go, they're all subjectivists, except about race where they're intrinsicists, right? Like what they're not is that they're never individualists. They're never like saying, well, who you really are. None of these things really tell you who you are, and you're who you think you choose to be.
So yeah, it's easier to do a negative value consensus on what they're not rather than on pinpoint what they are. So we need to wrap up because it's 46 past. So at 8 p.m. UK time, James Valiant and Robert and Amy Nasir are going to be discussing the sanction of the victim essay. Also, people, next week in London, so Wednesday, there's the discussion between Yaron Brook and Andrew Doyle on arts in the wake of, in the age of the culture wars. But also before that, me, Raka, and Claire Fox, Baroness Claire Fox, and we've known her probably from the Battle of Ideas and the Academy of Ideas. We're going to have a live discussion on the topic of free speech in times of war. What are we to make of the sanctions? What are we to make of all that? So I would really encourage you, first of all, if you're anywhere around, book your trip to London. If you're in London, check out our social media in terms of how to be part of this discussion. Jason.
Are there any more super chats we missed?
Oh, we have one more super chat. Yeah, sorry. Thank you very much, Tom. I really appreciate the comments. So Caleb asks, how would Marxists deal with so much productive work moving away from manual labor? Would programmers and data scientists be part of the proletariat? So the very serious Marxists would give you something like, this is surplus value exploited in the factory, but moved somewhere else. So in a way, it's by proxy, you're part of the exploited class. The not so orthodox Marxists would say, yes, that they are also exploited. I mean, even the Marxists would say they're exploited, even if they're paid a lot of money. What do you think, Jason?
Well, I was thinking of this, right? So I was thinking of content, like people who make content, put content on Facebook, right? Facebook has none of the liability for it, but they own it. And then they can do stuff with it. And that sounds like alienation. And that sounds like you not owning the means of production can, when we talk about content creators, can sound a lot like not owning the means of publication. Not exactly the same thing. And again, Marxists, they're materialists, so they want to see stuff you can hold in your hand. But I think they could adapt. What do you think?
Yeah, so they would say that you don't. So I would say, look, you own your laptop, and say, no, that's not the means of production, because even that, it's not yours, and it's the materialization of someone being exploited somewhere else. So you could say, Caleb, that indeed the way capitalism works today is a checkmate to Marxists, but Marxists wouldn't. Actually, there's a Canadian economist. His name is escaping me at the moment, who is good in a guy with a beard. Although, okay, that's not very unique for Marx, but he talks a lot about how Marxism is still relevant in the time of quote immaterial production, and of course theories like Negri, Tony Negri, and what's the other name? The Negri and Hyde, not Hyde. What's his name? Yeah. Anyway, the other guy. So they also try to come up with a theory of exploitation that does not include Negri and Hart, that does not include manual labor. I think that to do this, they did all kind of mental acrobatics that push them far away from Marxism. So I can't remember now the name of the Marxist economist. So Tom, Caleb, if you're more interested in that, drop me an email, nikos@aynrand.org, or put a comment on the YouTube channel, and I'll give you the particular links or the name of the Marxist economist who would try to answer this from a Marxist point of view.
But I think I just want to say one thing, and then before we go, which is I think that question is a good question, and talking it through and seeing, could a Marxist say this, could it say that, really highlights the problem at which the Marxists think of production materially, when man's means of production is mental, primarily, and only secondarily physical. And eventually we can reach a level of sort of science and production where it's possible for perhaps for everybody to own a means of production, or nobody. We just have robots going around, and all you need to do is figure out a way to do it. Like, so you might think, and any kind of Marxist story about, well, this is going to happen with the means of production, it's just making guesses about these things and underestimating the power of the human mind. You might have thought, like, okay, I as a hobby, I like to do little miniatures. You might have thought like some of these miniature companies 10 years ago had like these sort of like monopolistic control over this stuff, and the prices were just going to go up. They were going up and up and up and up. And then you're like, oh, they're gonna, like, it's just gonna suck, right? And then 3D printers came, and like they're racing to try to figure out what to do about it, right? And it's not just those companies; it's a million kinds of companies that 3D printers let anybody kind of compete with, right? So I think that, by the way, check out a discussion that Don Watkins and I had a few weeks back on Karl Popper, where we talk about Popper's argument against Marxist historicism on this point. Anyway, I think your question it does a nice job of highlighting this way that Marx is necessarily flat-footed when it comes to the intellectual components of human production, which are always the primary components, but as time goes by, become ever more central.
So, by the way, Caleb, the economist I was trying to think is Andrew Kliman, Kliman. He, from a Marxist point, he's the one who tries within a Marxist context to answer this question. Most of the others have given up on that Marxist concept. By the way, it doesn't mean that because he's in a Marxist concept, he's right. I'm just answering the question, what would Marxists say? Okay, this ended up being a lengthy episode. Thank you very much, Jason. Thanks to our viewers, to our super chatters, and to Daryl behind the scenes. Thanks, everyone. Have a good weekend. Bye-bye.
Bye.